Tony, can you just start by telling me a little bit about the origins of the World Trade Center, particularly the Twin Towers?
Most of the major elements of the project were in place before the architect was hired. That there were going to be very tall buildings, not yet the world's tallest, but very, very tall, a big plaza, an underground shopping arcade, connections to transportation. That was all in place before they hired the architect. So Yamasaki, the principal designer, was hired, I guess you could say, to create a package for this project that was already pretty well formed. He was an interesting choice because he was an out-of-towner, for one. He hadn't really done much in the way of skyscraper design. He was known for his plazas, for his human scale. He was so unprepared to be asked to do this that when he got the letter, which referenced a project that would cost $280 million, he thought there was a typo and there was an extra zero because he'd never done anything like that. When he got the job, he approached it as a work of sculpture. He made a gigantic model of Lower Manhattan, carved out the 12-block area that would be the site for the World Trade Center, and then started playing with shapes. He tried one tower. He tried two parallel towers. He tried three towers of different shapes. He tried four towers that were identical. He would have a wall of towers. There were more than 100 of these. And in the end, what he got was what we remember, the Twin Towers, two identical towers, not parallel to each other. If they were parallel to each other, the effect would have been very different. When you were in motion, either driving or better on a boat or on an airplane so you could pay attention, they sort of rotated around each other. And it was the fact that there were two of them that in Yamasaki's mind was the design.
Why were they so tall?
They're certainly going to be tall because the program called for 10 million square feet of space. And that's a lot of space. But the idea came from the Port Authority, and there are different stories about it, how it happened. One executive at the authority told me that it came from the Public Relations Department, which I believe. Lee Jaffe, I think was her name, in the PR department, thought this would be a great thing to do as long as we're going to build it that big. It's 30 years since anyone's done a tallest building in the world. Yeah, World Trade Center was going to surpass the Empire State Building. That was from 1930-31. Why don't we do it? And that word filtered down to Yamasaki. The World Trade Center towers were exactly 100 feet taller than the Empire State Building. And if that isn't one-upsmanship, I don't know what is.
Why did they have that graded facade?
The reason they look that way is because of two things. The windows are much narrower than they would normally be in an office building, and that's in part because of the structure and in part because Yamasaki suffered from acrophobia. He was afraid of heights, and he found that if the windows in any building were not quite as wide as his own shoulders, then he felt fine, and he felt other people would feel the same way. But then, aside from that, the frames around the windows actually project a good foot out from the building. If either one of those had been different, it wouldn't have looked this way. But by doing that, you don't see the glass. You see the metal, and in this case, it's very shiny aluminum. So it looks like shiny aluminum boxes, and when the sun hit them, they shimmered in the sunlight. It was just extraordinary. No one had designed anything like that. It was a brand new approach to skyscraper design.
Were there any controversies surrounding the construction?
Like any big project, of course, it was wildly controversial. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is a state entity. It's a quasi-public, they sell bonds. It's not exactly government, but it's not private. And therefore they can operate with basically eminent domain. They didn't have to follow anybody's rules. The city had no say in this. Well, that rubbed people the wrong way. It was an enormous amount of office space to be dumping on the financial district. That worried a lot of people. It replaced 12 entire blocks of city life, and the people who lived and worked in those 12 blocks weren't happy about it. It threatened not just the reputation of the Empire State Building as the world's tallest building, but its revenue, because the Empire State Building had all these television masts which paid rent. And if the World Trade Center were going to be taller, well, then the masts would end up there. So the Empire State Building's owners weren't happy about it. So I think there were something like 24 lawsuits that had to be settled before they could get going.
What did people think about the World Trade Center after it was built?
It's interesting how opinions swung. When the project was first announced, the major critics loved it. Alois Huxtable of the New York Times, Wolf von Eckert of the Washington Post thought it was fabulous. It was St. Mark's on the Hudson because it had some Gothic detail. They swooned. They really swooned about it. I've read their early stuff. And then the project did change. What we got was a second version, and that might have had something to do with a change in opinion. But by the time they were up, Alois Huxtable, Wolf von Eckart, and just about everybody else had decided that they were horrible, that they were banal, that there was, there was no human scale, that they were these gigantic towers with a few Gothic touches, and what's that about? And the only thing they had in common with St. Mark's would be the pigeons.
What kind of legacy do you think they leave behind?
The New Yorkers never much cared for the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. I mean, some did, but I think most didn't. At least the people who spoke about it that I knew didn't. Whereas out-of-towners thought, yes, that's New York. I suspect that's why they were a target, because those were, outsiders who attacked. And at the same time, I think that's why almost no New Yorker that I ever heard of thought that the Twin Towers should be rebuilt as they were. If, God forbid, it had been the Empire State Building, I'm sure there would have been an outcry, put it back, put it back. And you just didn't hear that about the Twin Towers. Nobody was that emotional about the Twin Towers, emotional about the attack, emotional about the change in the skyline. They're not there anymore. We got used to them, I think. As the new center goes up, I think we'll begin to think about what the old Trade Center looked like, because we'll have something to compare it to. Have we learned anything about design since the late 60s? It'll be interesting to see.